other lectures of the Lundin-Snider seminar series. It's my great pleasure to introduce José Manuel Serrato, who is an associate professor at the University of New Mexico. José Manuel obtained a bachelor in civil engineering from the National Autonomous University of Honduras. Then he moved to the US to do his master and PhD in environmental engineering from Virginia Tech. And then he was a postdoc researcher in Washington University in St. Louis before going to University of Mexico. Now he serves as an associate director of UNM Center for Water and the Environment, and is also affiliated to the UNM Metals Superfund Research Center. Mm-hmm. José Manuel's research interest is related to biogeochemical processes occurring at molecular and micro scales at the interface of water and energy. So a lot of things. So today we are going to hear about your research and more about the transport and remediation of metal mixtures in uranium mine waste in tribal land. Thanks for accepting the invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you, José. I really appreciate your hospitality, and thanks everyone for making this very intimidating auditorium so cozy. Because otherwise it would be a little intimidating. So this is great. So let me start, of course, by giving thanks to my funders, right? So first I'll start with the National Science Foundation, as José said, through the Center for Water and the Environment, and also through my career award, which finished very recently. I also have to thank the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences through the Superfund program. We have this UNM Metal Center, and it's similar to what happens here at the University of Arizona, right? You guys have a Superfund center, so we have one too. And we also thank Virginia Tech, my alma mater, because I will be showing you guys some, especially some spectroscopy and microscopy images that I obtained in their facilities. And also, whoops, what happened here? Let me see. Yeah, okay. Sorry, guys. Sometimes when I move from where these things, it does that. So anyways, I also want to thank the Stanford Synchrotron Radiation Light Source for, a lot of support. I'll show some data today that we collected there. And finally, this is a drawing that one of my former undergraduate researchers came up with. So this is how I call my group, the EH2O Research Group. The irony is that in Albuquerque, we also are surrounded by mountains, so it looks very similar to how you guys live here in Tucson. And this student very nicely put a pipe of water here, but honestly, we don't have any water in Albuquerque. So some similar challenges to you guys. A lot of sun, and then of course, a place that has had an important role in the nuclear history of this world, right? So let me also acknowledge a lot of people that have contributed to this work, graduate students, postdocs, faculty, from different departments, earth sciences, health sciences, engineering, I mean, you name it. But I do want to feature this person, Sherry DeVore, who will actually start as an assistant professor here at the University of Arizona this fall. She's going to be affiliated with the Department of Chemical and Environmental Engineering. And also, I want to thank, my friends, Jim Fields and Reyes Sierra from Chemical Engineering for training these incredible two postdocs that ended up in my research group, Lucia Rodriguez Freire and Jorge Gonzalez Estrella. Lucia is now in Newcastle University, and Jorge is in Oklahoma State University. So I also want to acknowledge that none of this work would be possible without working with the community, so we can be cozy here, right? And I kind of said that in chemical engineering. I'm sorry that you're recording this, but a lot of people in our scientific rigid community, right, think that only hard science is the thing, right? If you don't have hard science, then we're not talking. So meaning that a lot of times when you talk about community engagement, that's a lot of bullshit for tenure packages, right? But the reality is that none of this work would be possible if we didn't have those relationships, right? So I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the Southwest Research and Information Center. So this is Chris Shu and Paul Robinson, who have been incredible helping us on community engagement activities, the Blue Gap Tachi community in Navajo Nation. So my friends Aaron Jassy, Chris Ness, and Sadie Beal. I'll show you some samples that if it wasn't for their knowledge, I would have not known where to even start. And also the Laguna Environmental and Water Resources Department, so Adam Rinja, Gregory Jojola, Sabin Chavez, Vince Rodriguez, all some of these tribal people that also serve in the Environmental Department. My friend Juan, who I was talking about, Juan Lezama, is from Mexico. I'm from Honduras originally, so we have that synergy. And Scott Fender, of course, that has been a collaborator. Also from the University of Notre Dame, Virginia Rodriguez, or should I say Notre Dame, right? I know, I always get it wrong. But Virginia Rodriguez, Jennifer Simanowski, Ginger Sigmund, and my friend Peter Burns, who I was talking earlier this morning, actually. And then Lindsay Applegate and Tori Ford from University of Iowa, who broke my heart on Sunday because they didn't win, LSU beat them. I was cheering for Iowa, of course. But anyways, let's start here. So the research objective of this talk really is overall to investigate interfacial processes affecting the reactivity of metal mixtures in these mineways, right, in tribal land. And what we hope is to show you here that we can use various techniques, of course, spectroscopy, microscopy, aqueous chemistry. You mix them together and hopefully get a picture of what could be happening with respect to transport to understand risks from these mineway sites, right, which remains, unfortunately, a question. I will go through two sites today, the Blue Gap Tachi, Arizona site in Navajo Nation, and the Laguna, New Mexico site, which is actually about 45 minutes from Albuquerque, okay, in the Pueblo tribe. So the research question really is, what mechanisms affect the mobility in mineway sites, right? And as simple as it sounds, you will see very quickly this gets very fuzzy. Okay, so the picture here is, and I was trying to explain to Hervé as we were putting this talk together, because he helped me, believe it or not, give me feedback. This is a site in Blue Gap Tachi in Navajo Nation. We have, depending who you ask, at least 500 to 1,000 sites that look exactly the same as this one. What happened is that you have smaller mines that were extracted in bits and pieces, I'm gonna call it, right? With very rudimentary mining techniques that were available back in the 50s. So from the geosciences standpoint, let me ask you guys a question, just because a lot of you guys like geology and resources and that type of stuff. Do you guys know where the uranium from the atomic bomb came from? Anyone? Where? Four Corners area. Who else? No? Congo, exactly. Because at that time, in the 1940s, when we were in the rush of the Manhattan Project, there was no time for exploring anything, right? Had to get it right away. So they had to bring it from the Republic of Congo. It wasn't until some years after that there was this set to get the exploration started, right? So it wasn't until really, let's say maybe late 40s or early 50s, very well documented when that we really started to extract resources from these places. Another important point that I want to make is that some people say, well, a lot of this mining happened because nuclear energy, right? It's another one that I'm gonna call because, of course, it's nuclear weapons, right? We were in Cold War era, so this is very related to the nuclear history of the world, as I explained earlier, right? So the challenge becomes then, for these communities, there was a lot of this promise of, okay, guys, we need the uranium because it's an emergency, and we'll be back to clean it, right? We're still waiting after 1950s for these sites to be clean. So you can go and see, sorry guys, I don't know why this is doing this to me. That's why I sometimes like to just go old school, which I will. So, so that's why at the end, we ended up this deciding, let's say, in these sites to go directly to the communities and ask, about where the contamination is. So the reality today is that we have thousands of abandoned mine waste sites in the Western US with no remedial action, okay? A lot of these are rural communities, Native American communities that live in the proximity of these sites, and that's what we're showing in that picture in the top left, right, where you see where the house is located. So the house is here, and this is the site, right, where the waste is agglomerated. And reclamation of these sites really has meant more like, let's add a layer of soil to cover this top, so a layer of non-contaminated soil, and hope that it stays there, right? But if you are interested in geosciences or soil sciences, you know that, of course, climate change is real, even if people don't want to admit it. And we have all sorts of different climate, let's say, driven processes that contribute to weathering of this site. So if you go today, even if some of this reclamation happened back in the 90s, today you go and there's a lot of this material that is actually very, that contains elevated concentrations, right? More ore grade type of material now in the surface, okay? So I'm gonna show you today how we analyze this. So understanding the fundamental risk, let's say, and about the fate and transport of metals is necessary, especially for assessment of the risk and, of course, remediation, right? Because that's the hope eventually. So this is real data that I want to share with you. So in the top, uranium, arsenic, and pH. Okay, so let's start breaking this. We have two sites. The first one is the Blue Gaptachi site, which is mostly groundwater. What we see is that we have uranium concentrations as high as 169. For your reference, the maximum contaminant level of EPA is 30, right? And then we have a site in the Rio Paguari, which is just across of the Jack Pile mine. So just across here, there's a river that crosses where the concentrations can get as high as 700 micrograms per liter. This is that we have measured with my group. But there have been other reports that show even on the milligrams per liter. So we're talking thousands of micrograms per liter, okay? The other feature is, of course, uranium doesn't occur alone, and we see some exceedances of arsenic as well, right? This is driving me a little crazy. Give me 1 second. So the maximum contaminant level is 10. And the other thing is that we see acidic pHs at 3.5, which we were discussing earlier, right? Likely due to, I was talking to John Shore over yesterday in the morning about his interest on iron, sulfur, and arsenic. So this is probably what's happening here, right? If you oxidize pyrite, you end up producing some iron oxides that are likely oxidized, and therefore also you also oxidize some of that sulfide, and then producing some sulfuric acid likely, right? Which ends up producing these acidic conditions. And then also we have, some waters where we have high alkalinity. So we end up having alkaline types of pH around 8.7. I will revisit this later when I talk about remediation, okay? So stay tuned. The other thing that I want to feature is these are some of my first samples. I share this with a little nostalgia because when I got started, that's how I really got started by, like any assistant professor, right? Bits and pieces from here, bits and pieces from there. I didn't have a lot of money at the time, but we had the opportunity to, let's say, partner with some of my colleagues that had been working with the tribes for decades already. So they were able to introduce me, and we went to the sites, and I asked the tribe, okay, especially Navajo Nation, where do you think is not contaminated? And they knew. So BDL meaning here below detection limit for uranium, vanadium, arsenic. And so it took me, Jose, go here, take a scoop. That won't be contaminated. Okay. Where do you think is contaminated? There, okay. I went there, and as they mentioned, right, we have concentrations here in the thousands of milligrams per kilogram. Some more recent data that we have gotten in the group, especially in Laguna, we have gotten, more than 10,000 milligrams per kilogram. So more on the percent, 1 to 5% even sometimes. And of course, as I was saying, uranium doesn't occur alone. You have vanadium, you have arsenic enough that arsenic although it's in the tens compared to thousands, right? Is enough that it can result in the dissolution of arsenic to exceed the concentrations in the water of the MCL, right, of the maximum contaminant limit. And of course, it occurs with iron, right, which is why there's this interest on arsenic, iron, and sulfur that John and I were discussing yesterday. So, well, I'll start with this Blue Gap Tachi site in Arizona. This is in Navajo Nation, and these are some of the publications that have resulted in the group that I will show at the end. But this is to give you also an idea of the area, right? Because I actually went, and these are pictures that I took. So this is what I was showing you at the beginning. This is the site. And if I go climb and step on the top of this hill here, then I'm here. And this is how it looks. So as we say with Peter Burns, when I've taken him there, right? I mean, when the monsoon season comes, you don't need to be a PhD to know where the water is gonna go, right? You see here the very nice trail, and it goes to this pond where all these sheep drink water. Okay, so sheep and horses. So that's the reality there. When we have taken material, as I say, just as a poor assistant professor from a scoop here, take it to the lab. What we saw with scanning electron microscopy was that these primary minerals that were mainly feldspar, clay, quartz, contain these bright little coatings, we're gonna call them, right? That are brighter because they contain uranium. Uranium has an atomic weight of 238 grams per mole. So it's very easy for us to detect, right, when it's there. So, I mean, this is the signal that corresponds to uranium, potassium, and vanadium, indicating to us that we have this mineral carnotite. So this is the stoichiometry of carnotite. We have verified this with a lot of methods, diffraction. We did a microprobe. We published a whole paper just on the coming up with a stoichiometry of this specific phase in our samples, but it comes very similar to carnotite. And I guess this is important because then the particles break down. So this is a big boulder, and then you can see little rocks that contain this yellow. How many of you guys have heard the term yellow rock? Right, a yellow rock, which is the oxidized uranium. So uranium, when it gets oxidized, looks, uranium-6 oxides look yellow, okay? So this is actually a uranium-6 oxide, a carnotite, right? So let me go back, sorry guys. And then these, resulting from weathering or other processes, can result in smaller pebbles and then little rocks up to where you find these clusters of nanoparticles of carnotite that can also look like this, and where you can have isolated particles like this when in one of the dimensions is less than 100 nanometers, which you can see through TEM. And what happens here in the months of February and April? A lot of wind, right? And then that wind, that's the question that the community has, would this wind, result in any suspension of particles that we should be concerned of? And to everyone's surprise, maybe not surprised, but the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't currently yet regulate, right? Particle. I mean, let's be honest here. You have the inhalation, right? A pathway that is overlooked, we have to say. And the challenge is that not only is it overlooked, but also I have heard comments, well, where you guys are like some kilometers away, so it shouldn't be a problem. I spent my sabbatical in Spain. And in Spain, I saw particles coming from the Saharan desert. Okay, so how can that happen there? And that is, of course, possible, and everyone knows why it happens. And when you ask about this, no, that's not a problem. So, I mean, these are things that we should discuss, I hope, with where the science has to bring a context to this. And I'm not gonna show you a lot of details on this, but we ended up working with this good friend of mine, Peter Ligner, who is one of the world experts in reactive transport modeling. He was a co-developer of a code that is called pFlowtran that I love, because in addition to incorporating transport, equations that chemical engineers use. It also has a component for understanding reaction stoichiometry. And I really like that because what we did then is we did some column experiments. We used p-Floatran to understand if you assume that you flow waters, let's say, that have bicarbonate, and also we did some experiments with acetic acid, but this is just an example showing if you have a water with 10 millimolar bicarbonate, about the alkalinity that we see, and you flow, and you assume that the dissolution is controlled by carnotite, this curve nicely represents the data. So if you're a PhD student and you finally get that the experiments agreed with the models, you might graduate, right? So that's what happened to my student Suman. So thankfully he graduated. And this of course suggests that then the dissolution of this carnotite could be the key mechanism, right? In this case for dissolution of uranium. And this actually is something that is being considered right now as there are some studies of the risk assessment of this site. For vanadium, it doesn't look as pretty because, of course, the model under-predicted the vanadium, simply because vanadium co-occurs with other vanadate oxide minerals, right, that are more abundant than uranium. So meaning not all the vanadium is bound to uranium, but it could occur with other things. And that's why we have that discrepancy there. So these are publications from the group. This is one of the first ones that we got on the reporting the elevated concentrations of uranium, but this one is interesting because this forced us to work with the health sciences with my good friend, Matt Campen, and his lab that are more on toxicology, and they were able to do some animal studies, and we have worked with animal studies and also cell cultures showing that there are these potentiated cardiopulmonary toxicity effects, right? Once you have the inhalation of these particles. This is the paper that I was showing with the reactive transport of uranium and vanadium that Suman graduated with, so thanks, good for him. And finally, this is a paper that we published with my good friend Johanna Blake, who is now a very successful scientist in the US Geological Survey. But interestingly shows the reactivity of arsenic and uranium from this mine waste in Lugab-Tachi that I discussed in a lot of detail yesterday, but I want to show you another site today, okay? So this site is in Laguna, New Mexico. So this is about 40-minute drive from Albuquerque. These are some publications of the group that feature this work. And again, if anyone is interested in publications, please just contact me through Hervé, and I'll be happy to send them to you. Putting this presentation together, it made me realize maybe I should write a review article now, right, about this stuff, because sometimes the articles are in bits and pieces, and people don't get the full story. So I should write a review article of this story that I'm talking about. So one of these days, maybe. Okay. So this is actually the Jackpile mine, which I was showing at the beginning. This is a village. So you were asking me, how does a village look close to this mine? So this is one. And in Navajo Nation, for those of you who have been, people live very spread out. That's just how people, culturally like their space and keep their land that way, right? So in the Pueblo tribe is a little different. They try to agglomerate in villages where they have the villages and they share resources in a different way. So they actually live closer together. So this village that is very close to the mine, we have the Laguna, Paguari, and Mesira. On those villages, we have a population of approximately 5,000 to 10,000 people, something like that, okay? It's about 40 minutes from Albuquerque. So if you get out of I-40, for those of you who like driving out of New Mexico, so that will be going west, okay? You will pass the Route 66 Casino and the Laguna Burgers, which claim to be the best green chili burgers in the world. They're very good, actually. But this is where this site is located. It used to be the largest open pit mine in the world back in the 60s. And another thing that I want to feature is that the Pueblo of Laguna is about 2,000 feet from the mine site. I mean, really, it's very close, surprisingly close. The other thing that is fascinating is that when we have to communicate with the communities, I get so humbled all the time by this exercise, right? Because you're going with your supposedly knowledge and you talk and people, Jose, you're talking in like French, right? For me, or whatever it is, right? I don't get it. So we go through a lot of iteration on how to best explain this. And this is one idea that we actually got, right? Of coming up with a stoplight analysis. So red light, orange light, and green light, where green would be less than the maximum contaminant limit, meaning it's safe water. So above the mine or way downstream the mine, the concentrations that we have measured are below 30 micrograms per liter, the maximum contaminant limit. However, obviously, just across the mine, we get concentrations from 100 to 700 micrograms per liter, so pretty high in, a section of about 5 kilometers at least. Then there's a wetland there, and interestingly enough, I'll show you this later. In that area, the concentrations go lower, which is interesting. I'll show you our curiosity on that, also inspired by questions from the communities on why do the concentrations decrease so much here, right? So the Jack Pile mine has been listed as an EPA national priorities list for cleanup. So it's going through a risk assessment phase right now, trying to investigate. So this is actually an official Superfund site. This is another picture just showing that in the monsoon season, we get really high concentrations of uranium as a function of high flows, right? So this is historical data from USGS. And this is actually in this paper, but showing you that, but seasonal variability occurs, but these concentrations as high as 700 micrograms per liter would occur for us between July and September, and usually the monsoon season used to start in July. Now it's starting a little later. It's a little shifted. Sorry. It's a little shifted in the last few years. Let me try to. Sorry. I'll have to place this on. The problem is that if I put it too far away, you were saying right here, that's why I tried to place it closer, but I guess it didn't work well. Let's leave it there. Okay, so then this is just some transmission electron microscope and microprobe mapping, so electron microprobe analysis, just showing here that whenever you have uranium, it usually occurs whenever we have seen it. A lot of these, they're very abundant, uranium, potassium, phosphorus phases. These are the black ones that you see here, but it is surrounded by this junk here that doesn't do anything, and that when we go to the microprobe, all we see is a lot of carbon. So then when we have done some diffraction analysis, we have actually found the existence of coffeenite as well in these types of samples. So this is a uranium silicate phase, that co-occurs with all of these primary phases. So as I was telling you, the content of uranium in these samples can be from 1% to 5%, sometimes even. And what we have found is that the mineral is encapsulated by carbon. So one of the questions for us is, can we identify the effect of pH on new speciation and organic functional chemistry if we react some waters, right, from these materials from the Jack Pile mine? So the hypothesis that one of my PhD students had at the time, Carmen, was that this pH affected the binding of carboxylic functional groups of NOM, and that's what kept the uranium bound to it, right? So we ended up doing some investigations about this. But interestingly enough, what we see is always this co-occurrence of uranium-4 because of coffeenite, as I mentioned earlier. And we also see uranium-6, like that uranium potassium phosphate phase, right? So this is also just to illustrate here that when you are in the field trying to look for the actual samples, the darker the samples, the higher likelihood of being hot. So if you're going with a Geiger counter, this is very fascinating because usually you go and look for different areas. When you see black, beep, it's very hot. So we have been able to identify these dark materials. And honestly, I laugh about this slide. This is a cute slide that my PhD student put together because we pretty much analyze everything that we have in the University of New Mexico to analyze this sample, right, of how complex it is. So we have, X-ray fluorescence, X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. We go to the synchrotron and work with Juan, right, and do some X-ray absorption spectroscopy. We do some acid digestions and then do inductively coupled plasma analysis. We did loss on ignition and thermogravimetric analysis for organic matter. We analyzed fluorescence properties with this IMS fluorescence method that my good friend Chris Osborne from North Carolina State was very generous to work with us and gave us some ideas on how to go about this. And then we could actually look at reacted samples, both aqueous and solids, and look with the same techniques to see before and after the reaction at different pH conditions, right? So I'm gonna show you here. And Chris had a really good insight because he said, Jose, the typical way that we deal with this when we work with organic matter in oceans is you would get your sample. And of course, if you like organic chemistry, if you expose it to a really high pH, you deprotonate all of those organics, right? And then they would be released. So that's exactly what Chris suggested us to do. So we actually did experiments up to pH 13, but then we brought them down to 7 and 2 with the hopes then of, being able to identify humic and fulvic substances and the precipitation and changes that occur when those happen. And I'm not even gonna get into this conversation because organic matter people that have been working with this for decades get really annoyed when I start to trying to differentiate between humic and fulvic because they say, no, Jose, all of these are humates. We don't know what they are, okay? And everyone is different. It's a very contentious conversation. But thankfully for me as a spectroscopist, all I need to focus are functional groups, independent of what it is, right? So what we ended up finding is that the unreacted samples contained, anywhere from 13 to 40%, highly degraded organic carbon, right? Like lignite type of stuff, okay? But then when we changed these groups, what we found was that phenolic and carbonyl groups are actually the most abundant. And this was very, how can I say, this was actually a very replicable result to our interest. And actually the carboxylic groups, which Carmen thought were gonna be the most abundant, weren't, were the least abundant. This is an interesting finding, and I do want to continue exploring this in the future, of course, because if you like oxidation reduction reactions, phenolic groups are great, right, at facilitating a lot of reduction reactions, for example, right? You have the formation of quinone groups, and well, maybe that explains why you can see uranium-6 and uranium-4 in these samples, right? So it remains a hypothesis for me. We'll maybe do experiments later about this. Then we went to XPS and also to the synchrotron and confirmed that all these unreacted samples, both solids and supernatants, had a mixture of uranium-4 and uranium-6 at all pH values, right? So this was actually fascinating because you can see that these peaks are actually a little broader than we thought they were gonna be, right? So it's actually fascinating that you still have uranium-4 occurring in oxidizing conditions, which, when I did my postdoc in WashU and I worked with uraninite, for instance, uraninite readily oxidizes, and it's just interesting to see the stability of these uranium phases. So I'm going in the wrong direction, I guess, which you don't want, right? Because you want the talk to be finished. Okay, let me end with remediation. So how do we take this knowledge for remediation? And I'm gonna let this be the more provocative part of the talk, let's say. A lot of these things are in progress, but how they started is because the community asked this question to us, should we be concerned about these plants that are close to, the Rio Paguari, which I show you can have at 700 micrograms per liter. We know we have plants around the area, and then we have animals that eat there. What do you think? We'll say, well, so the first question, and this is actually Lucia Rodriguez Freire, who was a PhD student with Jim and Reyes in Arizona. We went to the field together. So this is for you guys to see. I go to the field sometimes. It's fun. I don't always stay in my desk, right? Although I'm an admitted bureaucrat nowadays. But, this is the sediment sample that contains 3 milligrams per kilogram. So this is like what we call a background uranium concentration, right, for a baseline soil. But interestingly, the roots contain up to 25 to 55 milligrams per kilogram. And the stems contain very little uranium, meaning that it doesn't really translocate in this specific sample, right? So these are actually salt cedars that we were able to connect with Lucia. Then when we took them to the synchrotron with Juan, we did very simple with some web, some micro fluorescence XRF mapping. And, this is actually just literally opening the sections of the plants and taking them, right? We didn't do anything to them. And what you see is that the uranium accumulates in the edge, right, in the cortex of the roots. So this ended up inspiring us to, okay, why don't we do some experiments? I'm not gonna grow salt cedars in the lab because you've seen how crazy they are, right? So we said, but why don't we use another hyperaccumulator like mustards, right, that are, easy to grow. So that's what we did. And these are actually some experiments in my lab conducted by Elian El Hayek. And then we acclimated them to a nutrient solution. So this is just so that they grew happily for 5 days. And once they grew enough, we exposed them to different concentrations of uranium and calcium for 14 days. And we try to use in this specific study what I would call concentrations that are pretty environmentally relevant, right? From the maximum contaminant limit to the highest concentration that we measured in Laguna at a pH of 7.5, just because that's about, what we have seen. And then the main finding of this study was that accumulation occurred in the cell walls only in waters with no calcium, which was very interesting because most of those waters have calcium. However, there's no detectable accumulation at high calcium concentrations because of uranyl calcium carbonate complexes that are usually either neutrally charged or maybe start to become slightly negative at pH 7, which was an interesting finding. But then we said, why don't we do another experiment with a higher concentration of uranium? So we used an experiment with a concentration of uranium of about, let's say, 19 milligrams per liter. What we found that is at those higher concentrations, when we see that calcium decreases uranium accumulation. So meaning that the higher the calcium, the less uranium accumulates, right? So consistent with what we find in the first study. However, what was really fascinating of this part is that we had more uranium go to the shoots when you had higher concentrations of calcium, meaning that although you had lower accumulation in the roots, the translocation is higher. Okay, so this is very fascinating because we were able to see it with transmission electron microscopy. So first, if you have 0 calcium, what you see is all these needles that accumulate in the outside of the cell, right? But as soon as you start to increase the calcium, then these needles start to dissolve or look different in shape, let's say, enough that they start to penetrate inside of the cell, if you see this, right? And even more at the highest calcium concentration. So this actually could explain some of the uptake, and our hypothesis on this, and actually corroborated by some of the recent literature, is that calcium pumps that plants have could facilitate then the transport of uranium into these plants. So this actually is in these publications from the group that, again, if anyone is curious, I'm very happy to facilitate. So one in environmental science and technology, another in ACS Earth and Space Chemistry. This actually made it to this supplementary cover. And then finally, Sherry DeVore, who is this student of mine that will start in the fall here, did this very, I'm saying fascinating experiments, because she made Jennifer Rogers, one of my colleagues from the University of New Mexico Biology Department. She leads the Seviera long-term experimental research station. And she's a plant ecologist, fungi ecologist, and we wonder, okay, just as you hear about microbiome, in the human body, right? How important the role it is. We were curious, okay, what about the microbiome in the roots, right? This rhizosphere, which contains both bacteria and fungi. So that's what got us started interested in fungi. And what we actually found was that in these experiments that Sherry did, the plants that had fungi grow very happily, okay? And we also were able to identify the precipitation of arsenic with calcium and phosphate in solutions that have calcium phosphate with them. So this is actually something that is food for thought, honestly, for our group, and we're continuing this research. Finally, use of natural minerals for remediation. So I don't want to scare you, but this is just quickly. The hope here is to hopefully remove both uranyl and arsenate if they're both present in the water, using reactions with calcium and phosphate because they're natural, right? Also, in the Jack Pile mine is a sandstone formation, very abundant calcium and carbonate, and that's why we've, chose. What about using a natural limestone and seeing if reaction with limestone and co-precipitation with hydroxyapatite could drive the co-precipitation, and also hopefully identifying the mechanisms for this. So some of the hypotheses that the limestone can contribute to removal of uranyl arsenate, especially in acidic conditions, because some of our previous work shows that uranyl arsenates are very stable at acidic conditions. And also that precipitation with apatite is a key mechanism for removal of uranyl and arsenic. So we ended up using this limestone close from the Sandia Mountains in Albuquerque that my friend Mary got. We characterized it. So here's the X-ray diffraction. All of the charge of this is negative at our pHs of interest, okay? So then, that's why I didn't want to scare you, right? This is me asking my postdoc, okay, how do we do this experiment? a lot of conditions, right? Just trying to see reactions with and without limestone, with calcium and phosphate, and where you hopefully have higher calcium and phosphate to enhance the supersaturation of calcium phosphate, right? That apatite phase. So we try to use concentrations of uranyl and arsenate that are ridiculously high, 1 millimolar, and some that are, closer to what we measure in the field, right? On the 50 micromolar, around that area. So what we found was that in the first few experiments, if you look at this, actually the limestone, which is this solid block, contributes the most precipitation of uranium and arsenic together, which is great at acidic pH. But if you work at pH 7, you get 0 removal. So this was actually very disappointing. And then we also found a similar trend, right, when we work with some addition of phosphate and calcium at lower pHs. And the uranium actually precipitated with calcium and phosphate, but not really with limestone, okay? So poor Hang, my postdoc just put a negative just across there because it didn't work. So finally, Han decided to increase the concentration of calcium and phosphate to 2 millimolar and 10 millimolar just to foster that precipitation of apatite, but also increase the pH then, because in our literature review, actually some papers of Pei O'Day that I like Pei a lot, as I told you. So we saw that there were some very nice solubility diagrams showing that apatite precipitation higher than pH 7, 8, 9, 10. So he very diligently said, I'm going to do an experiment at each pH until we find the saturation. Okay. So what he found is very fascinating. When you have experiments going from 7 to 10, and this is actually only with calcium phosphate, right? Interestingly enough, you do see that calcium decreases a little bit, phosphate decreases a lot, and this is because you have the formation of calcium phosphate, right? But calcium is in excess, I guess. But the fascinating thing to me was that uranium, as we expect, would precipitate very nicely with phosphate, and this has been shown very nicely by the Pacific Northwestern National Lab. John Sakara's group did a lot of this work. But what you see here is that at pH higher than 10, the uranium starts to resolubilize, and this is because of complexation with hydroxyl, right? At a concentration higher than 10, you start to have more than 10 to the minus 4 molar hydroxide, which then just complexes the uranium. But interestingly, the arsenic Now we bingo, find some removal that is optimal, I guess, at a pH between 8 and 9 or higher, right? And at a concentration that reaches almost the maximum contaminant limit established by GPA, which is actually a very encouraging result. And then we did some experiments with limestone too, which we find a similar result, but actually we got better results without limestone. So the apatite is actually what takes care of the coprecipitation. So this is just to show you some diffractions where we confirmed that actually hydroxyapatite was precipitated. This is shown just by different diffractogram features and also by some mapping that we did with SEM and also with electron microprobe showing that effectively calcium phosphate precipitates and also uranium with it, of course, and some arsenic. And this is a final map just showing you that calcium phosphate precipitates with uranium and arsenic. So the conclusion here being that with higher concentration of calcium and phosphate, we do get the removal of both uranyl and arsenate. And well, we have a hope because the optimal pH is between 8 and 9. And if I remind you, the highest range that we find at the beginning for these waters is 8.7. So this is actually an encouraging result for us that, question we got yesterday is when are you starting the column experiments, José, to show this, right? So we are very soon with the real waters, okay? So I'm gonna leave it here. I really thank you guys for having me here. It's been a pleasure to be here at the University of Arizona and from the University of New Mexico. All I can tell you is you have a home in Albuquerque. Whenever you come, let me know. And this is Sherry, who is starting in the fall. So I want you to see her face. She'll be an assistant professor, and I am incredibly excited that she will be starting here. These are my friends, Lucy and Jorge from the group, and this is Sherry again. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
All right, thank you so much, Jose, for this fascinating talk. It's time for questions now. Anyone has a question? Let's start with.
I was just curious when you were speaking about precipitating some of these minerals out. I did my undergrad in Ohio, and they do treatment of acid water drainage from the coal mines there, and they do some of the same things, put lime in the water, which eventually precipitates oxidized iron oxides. But the problem that we saw is that the iron oxide precipitate downstream and goes to a slack type of water, coats everything, and then kills it just in that area. Do you anticipate something that if you were able to have accomplished what you were mentioning, precipitating these minerals out of the water, do you imagine that being a downstream problem or adding to just another problem?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, man. So yes, not an easy one to answer, but let me illustrate here. And how we will go to application, I have no freaking idea, but I'll show you, I'll remind you the scale of the problem, right? So what EPA is doing right now, and this you can Google if you want, that's what the University of Arizona Superfund works with. One of the approaches, where's the light? So just to show these guys the picture. Is that what I do? Something like this, or something like that. Is that better? Just to remind you, right? This is the scale that we're talking about, man. It's huge. What EPA is doing today is they're calling it cap and plant, because you have to remember this is not only a water problem. This is a solid waste problem too. It's both things, right? So there is a stream that crosses across the mine, so that's a water problem. But we also have the solid. What about the solid waste that I talked about, right? That could resuspend. So what EPA is doing, okay, you know what we'll do? We'll add soil on the top, and we will plant it, and no one will notice that there was anything there, right? So that what we're going to with this research is, okay, in this cap and plant approach, can you be more purposeful of how you're capping so that you can have some minerals that would aid in keeping the uranium and arsenic there? That's what the research that we're doing is hoping to inform, rather than before inundating with calcium all the waters of New Mexico, man, which I'm not gonna do yet. we have to understand this first. So I guess a good pilot would be to constrain an area, right? That you know is gonna drain to the river and evaluate, right? I mean, in the thinking to the future, we're not there yet. But I think that's what would happen. This is cool, guys, because when we talk about plants, right? You see, where are the freaking plants here? Well, they are actually here. These little dots that you see here are all wild plants that just grow because nature is nature, right? It's incredible that they grow there because there's no water, man. If you go there in June, like June here, right? It's super dry, but they still survive. They manage to survive. So I think that's another thought, right? Of being purposeful with the types of plants and the capping material that you use. So I hope that I address a little bit of your question with what I'm going to, but humbly acknowledging, man, that I'm not gonna inundate with calcium New Mexico. Okay, me already is inundated with calcium, to be honest with you. Yeah. And any other questions? Can we turn on the light, man? Sorry, just wanted to answer them.
I'll let you get a drink.
Go for it, man. Like beers, you know, you're drinking. It's okay.
So I was curious, has anyone done any work looking at like activated carbon, for example, with this type of sequestration of uranium?
The answer is yes. Yeah, there have been, you know, honestly, one of the best technologies, if you're only treating water, which I hope you guys understand that this is not a water treatment problem, right? I mean, but for water treatment, if that was only it, there has been some really beautiful work showing that ion exchange is incredible. It's great. So ion exchange as a process has been widely used for removing uranium. There has been some work with activated carbon, but quite honestly, you have to play with, it's a problem of charge, right? Depending on what type of water, how much carbonate you have, how much calcium. So I was telling you, you know, everyone assumes that uranium is positive, but that's of course not true if you exceed a pH of 5, right? Because then uranyl starts to complex with carbonate, with calcium carbonate, as I showed today, or hydroxides, or organic matter, right, which I showed. So it becomes pretty complex, and it really depends on what the speciation of uranium would be for the absorption to really happen or not, I would question. So it's not as easy. What if you have an activated carbon that is negatively charged and you have uranyl carbonates that are negatively charged? It won't work. So it depends on what, you know, where you are in the speciation for activating carbon. But ion exchange works great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The question about the form of arsenic that you're precipitating. Do you know if the arsenate goes to the phosphate site in the apatite, or what's happening to the arsenic in your experiment?
There are a lot of things, man, but I'll have to go to, I'll cheat the chemical engineering problem because I presented this yesterday. Let me show you, man. So this is stuff that I showed yesterday in another talk that I try to make different, you see. So if no one came to the same talk because I don't recognize anyone, but if anyone did, I would have been embarrassed to give the same talk, man. So I did prepare a different talk. So the arsenic, when we have, and this is actually some stuff that we did with Scott together back in the days, with Scott Fender in Juan. When we did XPS, we have anywhere from arsenic -1 to up to arsenic 3 that we detected in solids, but then it's a detection limit problem between you and I. XPS is not a trace technique. When we did some other extractions, we actually find that arsenic 5 is very abundant too, right? Not surprisingly, in an oxidizing condition. So what happens here, and this is very related to the conversation we had with John yesterday for breakfast, is that you likely have arsenopyrite, right? Arsenic -1 with, and this is the other very interesting thing to prove that point, right? The baseline reference soil that the community chose that is not contaminated is mostly iron 3 versus the mine waste is actually mostly iron 2, right? So it is iron 2 likely bound to sulfide, right? With a -1 arsenic, that's arsenopyrite. And what happens here is going to that Superfund project, as John told me a story yesterday, that diagenesis, right, of arsenic What happens is if you expose the arsenic to oxidizing conditions, then it oxidizes up to 3 or 5, and the same thing happens to iron, right? So you have this evolution of iron 3 happening. I suspect the same thing happens to sulfur, and that's why you have the acidic pH too. So this is, in a nutshell, what could happen to the arsenic and then how it evolves. But to be very honest, how it occurs in particles with uranium is very challenging. It's a detection limit problem. Let me just show this slide here. This is, I have to show the freaking equations to the chemical engineers, right? So here they are, just to them, whatever. But look at this. This is actually a grain, admittedly, but we do have some different grains, you know, with Adrian Burley, who is a mineralogist. We found uranium and arsenic coinciding in these points, and this is what motivated this whole research that we have done with uranium arsenates too. So there could be some of that eventually happening as well, you know. So good luck with working with arsenic is what I mean, because I know that you'll have a lot of research going on that, but it's not an easy question to answer. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Well, I do probably have a basic one. So you were showing a map, you know, with the red, yellow,
Yes,
and green colors.
a microprobe.
No, the map about the uranium concentration in the rivers. I think.
Yes. I know what you're talking about. The one that I told you the community helped us make.
Yes.
This one.
And I realized that right in the middle of the Jackpine mine,
Yeah.
half is green, half is red. Is there like a specific feature that explain the sharp contrast?
It's elevation. So when green is upstream, and as soon as you get to the actual part of the mine that gets in contact with uranium, it gets red. Yeah. It's because we have to include elevation to these things, right? Geology people make me aware of these mistakes that I can make as I present this. I should have another profile with elevation so that you could see the cross section and see that, yeah, it's upstream, but as soon as it hits the mine, it gets this red. Yeah. I don't know if that answers.
Yep. Thank you. Perfect.